give you an uplifting, all problems solved talk tonight, but I'm going to talk a lot about problems that are unsolved, and as I think we all feel in our country, not only are the problems unsolved, but we worry daily ever more about the capacity of our country to not only address its own problems, but participate fruitfully in the solution of global problems. It's getting hard, and we have a lot of work cut out for us. And so I'm going to talk in that spirit, but also with a lot of hope in the students that are here. The faculty, my colleagues, I'm grateful, but it's the students that are going to have to solve these problems. So our job is actually to impart whatever tools and knowledge we can, because we're leaving you with a mess, believe me. And that's just, kind of the ultimate exam that you face. Clean up the planet in the next 25 years and collect the ultimate advanced degree. And that's really where we are now. Let's see if that's the right way to do it. Yeah. So, is there a path to sustainable development, and can we get on it? That's what I want to talk about tonight. That's such a big topic that we can talk about everything under that title, and I'll try to be a little bit disciplined because I have a tendency to meander to talk about things that are on my mind today. But I also want to finish early enough that we have a good, ample chance for discussion. And when we do have the discussion, you come to the mic, you don't have to ask a question, you can make a comment. Because sometimes it's told, please, no speeches, no comments, no long speeches, but feel free, because I think we really need to have a good discussion about these themes and the state of the country right now and the state of our ability to solve problems. I'll tell you the bottom line first. The world's a mess. The problems are solvable, but we're not solving them. And it raises a big puzzle. And so I'm going to end with the puzzle and hope, but try to explain that point of view. Let me show you some of the things that I see week by week in the Millennium villages in this case, or in other parts of the world as part of my work for the Secretary General. This is one of the villages in the Millennium Village Project in northern Ethiopia, a place called Koraro in Tigray province, outside of Mekelle. And it was, for me, a very unusual and shocking day a few years ago when we came to this site with the men digging this hole, because this is the river of the village, and it was, until recently, the perennial river of the village. It's no longer a perennial river, it's barely a river. It runs for a few weeks now during the rainy season, but for the rest of the year it's dry. Partly the rains have been on a secular decline in this area. Partly the upstream diversion of waters is sufficiently great that the hydrology is leading to a collapse of these minor river systems. So the men in this case were digging a hole in the middle of the riverbed to get to the water table, which you can see was about a meter down from the surface. And they had hired a pump that day to pump water up to the fields. Maybe I was naive, but I had never seen digging in the middle of a riverbed before of this kind. And we know from our work in this community that water is the life and death issue, as it is for hundreds of millions of people in the world's drylands, of which this is a part. And the situation is getting tougher, so this exemplifies a kind of desperate challenge when the river, which is the whole basis for why the communities are where they are has ceased, and the communities are fighting for their survival. This is a scene, again, a few years ago in a different Millennium village context in Western Kenya. Fortunately, the picture there today would not be like this, but it certainly remains like this in other places in sub-Saharan Africa. 2 patients to a bed. I had never seen that before I began working in Africa. Patients lying head to foot, each infectious with some awful communicable disease, strangers sharing the scarce, incredibly underfinanced and underprovisioned healthcare system. And you can see the plastic jerry cans under the bed, because it was the case in this clinic, no longer because of the Millennium Village Project, but again, in thousands or tens of thousands of such clinics in Africa and around the world, that patients have to bring their own water. There is no running water. The lack of running water in a clinic is almost unthinkable as the first line of proper public health. It's been known for 170 years that the first command for a doctor is wash your hands, or for a nurse is wash your hands. Otherwise, you're going to be doing as much damage transmitting disease among the patients as you will be saving them, something that Semmelweis found in the 1840s in the large number of deaths of women in childbirth because of the septic conditions. And yet, all over the world, if people can make it to clinics, they make it to clinics where there is no hand washing and there is no running water at all. And it's obviously, in this case, an even more dreadful reality when the pandemic diseases are running so out of control. The situation here has changed. The possibility of the situation changing more generally is, of course, very real, and I'll explain why that is, but it hasn't happened yet. This, of course, is a very different kind of picture. It's Katrina bearing down on New Orleans, and we know that the ecological threats are not anything special for poor countries. It's true that the poor and the elderly die in disproportion. That's the basic lesson of all natural hazards. And poor people are extraordinarily vulnerable. But rich countries are also vulnerable, and our country has displayed a particular incompetence in recent years, which makes us especially vulnerable. And I was just in New Orleans about a month ago now, and you know, while there has been some rebuilding, the fact is that recent studies have found that half or more of the kids who were displaced are now experiencing serious psychological and learning problems and continued health problems. And FEMA is still using the same formaldehyde laden trailers and other emergencies, and we simply in our country can't get our act together to be ready for this. And in a related disaster, you probably read in recent days that in the case of the Haiti earthquake, which claimed about 300,000 lives, perhaps the gravest single toll from an earthquake in history, or number 2. You know, the United States has not yet appropriated $1 for Haiti's reconstruction. It's all surface talk so far. And this is the constant reality of the difference of perception and nice talk and happy meetings, and a world which is at ever greater threat. So what is the real nature of this threat? As Bob mentioned, my career of careening from Latin America to Eastern Europe to Russia to India, China, and Africa. It seems like a kind of bizarre kaleidoscope or a different change of interests or different phases of my own work, but I see it as a unity. Something that I realized already back 25 years ago, or really felt from that 25th to the 20th year ago, somewhere between Bolivia and Poland, when I really realized that the dominant reality that I was experiencing as I was working in these particular countries, though I was addressing specific local problems in my thinking and work, was that a new world of interconnection was taking shape before my eyes. I was feeling that I was seeing globalization in its most dramatic form, close up, and that each government that I was working with was essentially grappling with the same question. How do we fit in to this world that is becoming hyper-interconnected? And that was true of Bolivia in 1985, and it was true of Brazil in 1987, and Poland in 1989, and Russia in 1991, and when I began working intensively in India around that same time, and so forth. And I have had that feeling from those early days that this really is a piece of a whole, that we are quickly evolving towards a global civilization. Maybe that's too glorified, because civilization has connotations which we don't yet deserve. But we are evolving quickly towards an interconnected global society. And we don't understand the rules of it, and we don't understand how to behave in it, and we don't understand the jeopardy that it is creating for the world through our inadvertence and our neglect as well, especially on the environmental front, but not only, also on the intercultural and interpersonal front as well. And all of my thinking really for 25 years, however good or bad it's been, has been about the question of how to make this world that is coming into being work effectively. And by effectively, I mean work for everybody, first of all, not just for pockets of humanity. But if we're all interconnected, can everybody have their place in the sun? And then more and more, of course, and I'm in a way a latecomer to this, and I would say it really only, each stop of my own journey opened my eyes to new facets that I didn't really imagine before seeing them. So I have to say that that's part of why I want students to go out and see the world and experience it in more than one place, because comparison is also vital for knowledge. But part of the learning was how all parts are coming to a shared interconnected world. Part of the learning was how that's happening in very diverse ways, of course. Part of it was understanding, and it's only 15 years for me, and even really grappling with this, what truly extreme poverty is all about. Because until I began working in Africa, I didn't get it. And it's a different quality when it's as extreme as it can be. And if you haven't seen it and experienced it, you can't really know it. I couldn't know it. My imagination's just not good enough. And then realizing the ecological dimensions. And of course, those grow on you more and more when you see that every place that you're working is also under ecological crisis. So there's nothing particular. There isn't a place where you can land on the planet if your eyes are open and if you're attentive to realities and also talking to local experts, ecologists, and practitioners that isn't sharing an ecological crisis as well. So that poses a big question for us, or a big problem, and that's what I take to be the challenge of sustainable development, broadly put, which is how can we make this planet work for everybody, and how can we make it work not only now, but in the future? And in America, that becomes a hard question to ask, because we don't even think about the future in this country anymore, if you define the future as post-election. The only thing we do is we think up till November, and then the rest is somebody else's problem. And so this is why our country hasn't grasped this issue, and certainly not grasped it with any kind of leadership. Now, the concept, as you know, of sustainable development has come to us through one of my favorite world leaders, Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, former Prime Minister of Norway. And then I had the pleasure and honor to work for her when I chaired a commission for the World Health Organization when she was Director General of the World Health Organization about a decade ago. She was the chair of the commission, which bears her name, the Brundtland Commission, which really brought the concept of sustainable development to global politics, if not to global policy, because it's still not in global policy. It's only at a conceptual level. And in the Brundtland Commission report, a very general definition was given: development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's not my favorite definition, I have to say, because it's hard to know what it means and how to operationalize it and how to turn it into something that is useful and practical. And I'm a very practical person because I want to know what to do now, and what to do now with a vision of what to do in the future. So in practical terms, I try to ask the question, can three things happen simultaneously on the planet? First, can the material well-being of poorer countries rise at a pace that allows them to narrow the gap in material well-being with the rich countries? Now, I'm using the phrase material well-being rather than GNP per capita or other indicators because there's a huge gap between what we measure and what we really mean. And of course, proper measurement of the concepts of material well-being are at the center of the actual challenge of sustainable development. If we mean GNP per capita, we're on a fool's errand, because that's a foolish measure for a lot of what we're after in the world. But there are real gaps in material well-being, such as life expectancy, child mortality, undernutrition, that count a lot. And we have to measure this right. And the first question is, can the gaps be closed with the poorer countries, gaps that are important in quality of life and especially in material conditions? Second, is there continued scope for improved well-being of the high-income countries? That would mean us. That poses a question on which people have different views. Will the rich world have to make major sacrifices in life standards in some meaningful way in order for poor countries to have their place on the planet? Or, to put it another way, if the rich countries hang in with what they're doing, would that block the ability of poor countries to develop? Or is it possible for both rich and poor countries to enjoy continued meaningful economic progress? Of course, meaningful is a loaded word. What do I mean by meaningful? And I'll come back to that later. But I'd like to think that the gains for the poor don't have to mean the sacrifices by the rich. There are things we do and consume that aren't good for us, so sacrificing the bad things wouldn't be a bad idea. But there are things we do which we really like and which give us pleasure and a sense of well-being and security and so forth, which we don't want to give up And the question is, will we have to give those things up? Or can we continue to enjoy those benefits of past development? And third, can those two things be done in a way which is consistent with the sustained functioning of the Earth's ecosystems, including, but I could make a long list of what it includes, including the conservation of biodiversity. And I put biodiversity there. I could have put climate, or I could have put other of the challenges, because there's almost a literal sense in which we are just pushing the rest of the world's species off the planet right now in quest of our own material consumption. And so the question is not only sustainability, but can we live in some kind of biological harmony with the rest of nature, something we're surely not doing right now. That, to my mind, is a little bit more operational about sustainable development, although it obviously opens up lots of problems as well. But what I'm really asking, can the poor catch up progressively with where they want to be, especially the extreme poor? Can the rich not suffer a collapse of living standards? And can we do this in a sensible way which preserves the Earth's major ecosystems, climate, biodiversity, and other natural needs? Is this feasible? Nobody knows. And expert opinion varies widely on this question. James Lovelock says it's already gone. The author of the Gaia theory in his most recent book says that the best we can hope for are a few refuges for hundreds of millions of humanity, because the rest are on a path of disaster. It's completely impossible for us to think, I find it impossible to think in those terms, even if he's right, because it's literally unthinkable for me. But he may be right, because he's very smart, and he's gotten a lot right about the nature of the planet, and it's not an ill-considered or empty view. It's a view that we've already passed various tipping points, and we're on a path of massive destruction. Of course, there's the other side, which is the fantasy side, which is the term I use for the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which says, problem? What problem? There is no problem. All of these concerns are simply a part of a grand conspiracy of climate scientists out to get rich, become famous, and win big grants. If you want to get rich and be famous, I would recommend you not become a climate scientist, by the way. Boy, is it a long, slow slog to do it that way. But that is the view of the American right wing, which is exemplified by the Wall Street Journal. It is shambolic, it's disgraceful, it's idiotic, and it's absolutely targeted. It's not just foolishness of belief, it's pure propaganda and disinformation by powerful interests. I don't know what they're serving in the long term, because they're out to wreck the planet, but they think that they're serving the interests of the oil companies and others in the short term. And in that sense, they're doing a good job, because so far they've stopped all measured progress in our country in taking on some of these big themes. So that's a very small print. You're told never to have more than 7 words or so on a slide. But let me just summarize by saying that the world is not achieving sustainable development right now. So if there's any doubt of students, should we major in this area, or will the problems all be over by the time we graduate, so there'll be nothing for us to do? This is a great booming area, the collapse of the world. So believe me, there's a big future in crisis. And you can go into this knowing that no major problem will have been solved by the time it's your responsibility to solve it. This is good news. Lots of interesting things to do. So, what is the state of the world right now in terms of that agenda as I defined it? First, the world's operating at such multiple speeds, it's really remarkable. First, we operate at multiple levels, between rich beyond knowing what to do with rich, to poverty so poor that you can't imagine it until you see it with your own eyes, at least for me. And sometimes I'm on a plane between one to the other within 8 hours, and it's also a jolting experience to come back from a completely impoverished village where people are hungry and children are dying, and then come back to downtown Manhattan, where the lights are on and the restaurants are full, and it is a glorious achievement in its way, but it's the same planet so tightly bound together. So the rich world, as you know, is about 1 billion people. The so-called middle-income countries are about 3.5 billion people. Their daily survival. That's the poorest of the poor, the extreme poverty. We don't have an agreement on how to measure it exactly. I view it as being deprived of things needed access to a clinic in case you get a threatening infection and so forth. And between 1.5 billion people do assurance of survival. Their lives may end up dead the next day because of a mosquito bite unattended. Something completely absurd and tragic. And that's this weird world of ours right now. And that's the sense I have of, can't we somehow figure out how to make this work a little bit better than that? Now, there is some very important good news, and that is that there is a tremendous amount of economic progress going on. In fact, it is so great that for a lot of the world, there is no such thing as the economic crisis right now. In China, in India, in Brazil, and in many other countries, the economic growth rate measured by GNP, a very flawed measure but still useful, is 8 to 10% per year right now. In fact, the rich countries grow forecast at about 2% during the next 12 months, whereas the developed world on average will grow at about 7% during the next 12 months. So the world is achieving economic development. And that's no small thing, because along with that growth is coming longevity, is coming better nutrition, is coming better education, safer premises, more access to knowledge and information, more resilience to shocks, and so on. So I'm not at all of the school that development is a kind of useless thing. There are big questions about the meaning of our GNP, and I'll come back to that. But for a poor country, those questions are secondary to the primary benefits of what we actually measure as GNP. Higher GNP in Africa, that's a good thing. It means an improvement of life chances of survival and access, and there's a widespread improvement underway right now. It's one of the defining features of our age, actually. Third fact is that the total size of the world economy is rising in per capita terms and of course, in absolute terms. And That's true even through the recent economic crisis. And overall world growth is about 4% now. We're struggling here, but because of that rapid growth in the low and middle income countries on average, we're still seeing a world that is going to achieve a doubling of total world GNP in less than 20 years. Remember, divide 70 by your annual growth rate and you get the doubling time, so that's something on the order of about 18 years, 17 to 18 years, for the doubling time of the world economy right now. So that's pretty good news, actually. Of course, in my three-part definition of sustainable development, the rich world's kind of, it's barely holding on. The poor countries on average are doing better. But now here come all the important exceptions. First, there's a significant part of the poor world that isn't part of this rapid catching up right now. Those are countries I've characterized as being in a poverty trap. Somehow the advantages of relative backwardness, as a great economic historian Alexander Gerschenkron once called it, the idea that if you start farther back you can leapfrog all those technologies, isn't working in certain parts of the world. It's not working in Afghanistan, it's not working in Somalia, it's not working in Yemen, it's not working in Chad, it's not working in Niger right now. These are places falling further and further behind. The situation is desperate, and we need to understand that. Fifth point is that it's getting harder because the planet's getting more crowded. So part of sustainability at some point has to be that the population stops growing so fast. In proportionate terms, there has been a significant slowdown of global population growth from about a peak of 2.1% per year in the early 1970s to the current rate of about 1.1% now. But the absolute number of population increase has been almost unchanged because the base has doubled. And so we're still adding about 80 million people net per year. And not in the easiest places in the world, mind you, because the rich countries are under sustainable, or under the replacement rate of total fertility. It's the poorest places in the world where the fertility rates remain the highest. So we're still on a rising trajectory. And finally, and this is true for every place, the world's ecosystems are in such a state of pressure right now that there's not an ecosystem in the world that you can find that is not being deranged and degraded by global anthropogenic, that is human-induced forcings. This summer I was in one of the most remote areas of the world, not to the people who live there, but to the people who try to get there, and that's Bhutan, which is an absolute paradise kingdom between India and China, and it is the folds of the Himalayas in absolutely wondrous country. Very hard to reach and relatively hard to move around. And you might think, well, at least they're outside of the range of effect. But, of course, they're experiencing one crisis after another because their glaciers are melting, forming lakes that then burst in glacier lake outflows and cause death and destruction below. And so you can't go anywhere on our planet and not feel the planetary forcings right now and feel the pressures of global change. But of course there are some places that are absolutely already desperately in the front lines. So those are the broad dimensions of the challenge, a world multi-speed, highly differentiated, growing fast, continued population growth, and massive anthropogenic forcings creating huge challenges and problems for the world. Let me amplify just a few points briefly to try to set the picture with a little bit more clarity, and then talk about what this means in terms of human agency. What does it mean for us to do? What are the challenges? What does this add up to? So the first point is the good news point, at least from my point of view, but it's also the great change that we're living through, whether we have a recession or not a recession, and it's what I like to call the age of convergence. There is a tremendous convergence of living standards underway in the world because the process of rapid economic growth has truly been unlocked by a large part of the so-called developing world. There's a lot to say about this very complicated story, because for the first 150 years of the modern industrial revolution, roughly between 1800 and 1950, we lived in an age of divergence, where the rich grew much faster than the poor. And that was the rise of the United States and the British Empire before that as the dominant role of the world. And it was the West, of course, it's the story of the West's domination over the rest of the world. That's a relatively recent phenomenon of about 200 to 250 years in its real, implication. About 50 years ago, that process stopped and the process of convergence got underway. I think it's related to technological changes and to the end of the colonial era, or the imperial era. I think it has both political and technological roots. But it did mean that the technologies that had brought the West to this superior position were now available for everybody. And literacy spread, modern transport information systems, diffusion of knowledge, diffusion of industrial capacity, and eventually diffusion of market institutions also. And all of that added up to an age in which convergence is the dominant fact. And of course, we experience this most centrally as the rise of China. China will be the world's largest economy soon. And it will still be poorer than the United States in per capita terms for several decades, but it will be larger than the United States in absolute size. And just about every country I go to in recent months, China's already the largest trading partner of that country. The most recent was when I was in Chile a couple of weeks ago, and China had just overtaken the United States as the largest trading partner of Chile. Kind of amazing, actually. But that's happening all over the world. It's good, but it's making us very neurotic in this country. So you can't go a day without reading about some nefarious thing that China's doing. And I suppose if I watch TV, which I don't, so I can't tell you, but I hear that the advertisements for all the congressional campaigns are bashing China one after another. Who's softer on China? This is how lead countries feel when they look back and they see someone gaining on them. It's a very unsettling feeling, and it's America's reality, and it's not going to change, in my view. So this is part of the world that we're in. I made some simple, these aren't really forecasts, they're mechanical projections using a standard economic growth dynamic model just to illustrate how normal catching up growth would affect the relative sizes of economies. China overtakes the United States by 2025 in absolute GNP. India has overtaken the United States by 2050, and by 2100, which is the lower right-hand quadrant, you see the U.S. far smaller than China and India. These are not forecasts. What they are is mechanical, gradual narrowing of gaps that is what is called the convergence relationship, using a standard empirical relationship. Of course, the world could do many funny things between now and then, but I think that this is a modal forecast, actually. And it does mean, not surprisingly, that Asia will become the center of gravity of the world's economy in the 21st century for a simple reason. That's where the people are. Asia has 60% of the world's population. So it's really weird that as of 1970, it was only 20% of the world's GNP. There are libraries full of books explaining that reason, that fact, but that fact is what's changing now. And catching up, I believe, is a general phenomenon, and all countries can be party to it. Demography, I mentioned, is the second crucial phenomenon. This is the UN's range of forecasts. They do a low variant, medium variant, high variant, and constant fertility forecast. The range is between 8 billion people in 2050 for the low fertility variant, up to about 11.5 billion people in the constant fertility variant, and the so-called medium variant is at 9 billion people. When we say there will be 9 billion people by 2050, all we're doing is speaking shorthand that we're taking a medium forecast in a big range of uncertainty. If we acted properly, we might be able to stabilize at 8 billion people. That'd be a lovely thing to do, actually. The reason is not just the difference of 8 and 9 billion as a billion people more pressure on the planet. It's where the added populations are coming. And it's coming in absolutely the poorest places of the world. And that is in tropical Africa. You see Yemen, in the Arabian Peninsula in red. You see Pakistan. These are not happy places right now. They can't absorb massive increases of population very well. They're under huge ecological stress, extreme poverty, and tremendous pressures. And of course, high fertility rates at this point are a sign of, I would say, failures of social and health systems to a very large extent. It means that women don't have access to contraception on a reliable basis, and for many reasons they're too poor or too disempowered to be able to choose to have fewer children. Large families are no help for impoverished, large numbers of children, I should say, are no help for impoverished families, and there's certainly no help for the children that are born into these impoverished families. It almost condemns them to a life of poverty, to be one of 6 or 7 or 8 siblings, because the family can't afford proper nutrition, health care, and education for these families. Now, the ecosystem stresses are everywhere. Fortunately, you have 90 lectures in your series, so I don't have to elaborate. But I think the main point about the ecosystem stresses are that they are pervasive and multidimensional, and basically synergistic in a nonlinear world. What does that mean? It means that we're close to cliffs, to tipping points, whatever nonlinear point where you have a major change of slope, and we've got lots of dangers. Climate change is perhaps the most general of them all, but it's by no means the only major global scale challenge. There's a terrific paper last year in Nature, September 23rd, 2009, called A Safe Operating Space for Humanity, where a couple of dozen ecologists tried to identify the major areas of global scale threat and then to assess how close we might be to thresholds. And climate change is one of them, but the two areas that are shown in red all the way to the boundary, the one here is the nitrogen cycle. We're putting on about 100 million metric tons of nitrogen in fertilizer to grow the world's crops, and this is creating massive derangement, mainly eutrophication of now about 130 significant estuaries around the world, including the Gulf of Mexico, hypoxic dead zone. But that is a common phenomenon all over the world. Many people say, by the way, let's go to organic farming or other approaches. That has almost nothing to do with this issue, because whether you put the nitrogen on by chemical fertilizer or whether you put it on in compost, you get the same runoff. It's the same nitrogen. The fact of the matter is, for such intensive production of grain, we have to intensify the nitrogen feeding under our current technologies so much that the environmental impacts are massive. And I think this is quite interesting, by the way. Interesting is an interesting word in this context, because we have not actually yet disproved Malthus, although it's the economist's great pleasure to mock Malthus. That was the first thing I learned as a freshman in economics, was how silly Malthus was, the guy who said you couldn't keep up with population. Well, the fact of the matter is we haven't proven yet we can keep up with population, because our food production system is not sustainable yet. It's causing massive derangement. And of course, food is actually the #1 source of anthropogenic change on the planet, the food system. More than transport, more than automobiles, more than power plants. It's agriculture, because that's where the land use change is, that's where the nitrogen and phosphorus deposition is, that's where the deforestation comes from, that's where the methane and nitrous oxide emissions come from, and it's where a lot of the energy is used that directly emits carbon dioxide. So we do not yet have a sustainable agriculture system for 7 billion people, much less for the 8 or 9 or 10 or 11 billion people that we might have. Malthus is still in the running. That's not a happy thought, but it is a true thought that all this great stuff has just taught us how to destroy nature more effectively, but it hasn't yet proven that we can manage sustainably even simply the food question. The other bright red ray or cone that's going off on the left is biodiversity loss. That's also related most heavily to agriculture. But we are, in a way, as I said, just pushing the rest of the species off the planet. Peter Vitousek, the great ecologist at Stanford, about 15 years ago made the first estimates that the human appropriation of net primary productivity from photosynthesis is 40 to 50% of total photosynthesis on the planet, when you take into account the direct crop growth, the pastures, and the stuff under the asphalt. So the production that is no longer possible because of the land use change. That's a lot. And ultimately, the rest of the species live on that stuff. And that's what we're, that is the massive destruction. Of course, this is the picture of the deviations from the base temperatures of 1950 to 1980. This is for the first half of the past decade. This past year is, or the current year that we're still completing right now, will be one of the warmest in history. And the April, May, June quarter was the warmest in human history. Now there's a little bit of cooling because we've gone from an El Nino to a La Nina phase, and that means a little bit of global cooling. So we don't know how the world as a whole will rank in these ratings, but climate change is the next. And this is the famous World Wildlife Index of species abundance, the so-called Living Planet Index that WWF produces. And basically all species are under threat. You may have read last weekend that there have been new findings about the collapse of the honeybee populations, seeming to be an interaction of fungus and viral pathogens, or pest and pathogen. But the fact of the matter is we're seeing that kind of collapse in amphibious populations and other pollinators. They're all under stress and vulnerable to invasive species, to pathogens, to pests, to habitat change, to climate change. If one doesn't get you, the other's going to get you. It's the perfect Agatha Christie mystery. For every destruction of the species, there are 10 good culprits around. And we don't know exactly which one it is, but they're actually synergistic, because species decline and then collapse is a nonlinear threshold process typically, and we're pushing one species after another to that brink, and then something pushes the species over. So, on top of all of this, so we have convergent economic growth, mostly very good news. We have this massive and growing ecological threat, and then we have part of the world really stuck and unstable. And exactly how stuck and unstable is a very subtle question. And stuck in what ways is a big debate. I tend to emphasize geographical factors in reasons why certain places are still stuck. If they're more dry, if they're more landlocked, if they're more malarious, if they're more mountainous, and so on. My colleagues don't like that. They tend to emphasize social and institutional factors and political factors rather than the ecological and geographical factors. They're so intertwined, it's sometimes hard to know, of course. But in any event, what remains true is that sub-Saharan Africa and large parts of South Asia are the remaining areas where poverty is deep and stuck, and at least in some places continuing to grow. And the previous slide was showing the distribution of stunting as an indicator of hunger, and this one, distribution of under one mortality, infant mortality. And you can see, again, it's mainly tropical Africa. Afghanistan always shows up, not coincidentally, as an ecologically stressed, politically ravaged, landlocked country in the drylands. It's got every indicator of why they should be in a mess, and I can assure you that 100,000 U.S. troops can do no good in addressing any of the things that really ail that country. But they, of course, Afghanistan shows up in that very serious way. Now, one thing that I've come to believe is that these ecological crises really are at the core of a tremendous amount of the violence and unrest that we're seeing, including in Afghanistan, including in Yemen, including in Somalia, including in Darfur. And while this seems obvious, it is not even on the minds of the policymakers. And if you read the new Bob Woodward book on Obama's war in Afghanistan, you'll read 300 pages or so without one single sentence of insight about Afghanistan. It's all about what the generals think. And the generals only know bombing targets. They know nothing about the rest of this. And there was no one in Obama's group that knew anything about Afghanistan that I could see in reading that book, that understood anything about culture, poverty, development, ecology. And so this issue of the underpinnings of hunger, water stress, and so forth as being part of the crisis is so far from the thinking of our policymakers, it's absolutely shocking. And I shouldn't digress because I could run on for hours, and I think I was supposed to stop hours ago. But let me just say, I was once called to the UN. We're going to have a meeting about the crisis of water in Darfur, I was told. I said, thanks God. I've been waiting for years. I've been saying this is a water crisis. Finally, they're going to talk about it. I ran over to the UN. It was not what I thought. It was the peacekeeping office that had called the meeting. The problem was they could not figure out how to get enough water for 26,000 peacekeepers in Darfur because it's a very dry place. I unhelpfully said, well, you see, there's 7 million people there. That may give you some insight into the problem. They said, that's fine, Professor Sachs, but we're here to talk about the peacekeepers. So there was still, to that moment, not a discussion about water in Darfur, which is really the ultimate root of the crisis. And this graph, a little bit hard to see and to read, the blue lines, the green lines show water precipitation above average in Darfur. The brown lines, precipitation in Darfur below average. And you can see that we went through a secular decline of precipitation in Darfur, and that's true of a lot of the Sahel. And it's not an accident that this is the period in which the crisis intensified and exploded, because nomadic populations or semi-nomadic populations, or let's just say pastoralist populations, were on the move, trying to find places to resettle. And that was the proximate trigger of a tremendous amount of the violence. And we just don't have a handle on that politically. So let me quickly summarize and talk about a few solutions. The most challenging problems from a resource point of view are the food supply, regionally and globally, the energy supply in a way that can address climate change, and the protection of biodiversity. And it pushes us, I don't have time to go through these, it pushes us, in my opinion, to the need to identify new and largely technological approaches to these issues. That's deeply unsatisfying for most people. First, technology created a lot of the problems, so why do you go for more technology? And the problem is that we're living with 7 billion, soon to be 8 billion people. I can't see simpler systems being able to handle the scale of human need. And so we're trapped in a way. We really are in a Promethean trap, that we're going to need to use the instruments that they've gotten us some way, but they've also created a lot of these problems. We're going to need to find effective approaches going forward. The other reason that it is not quite settling is that we can see from our own country, and I think it's true globally, and I think it is fundamentally true, that the ultimate decision to define, direct attention, and spread the diffusion, or to diffuse and spread the uptake of sustainable technologies will not itself be technological or even political, but will have to be values driven. And so technologies may save us, but it's only going to be a desire to be saved and a recognition of what's at stake and a willingness to cooperate that's going to be fundamental for that. I'm worried, frankly, because we're just not very good at this thing called cooperation. And we seem to be getting worse. And I don't mean to be morbid about it, but I'm painfully aware that history has its breakpoints and things are not necessarily smooth. And I tell my students all the time, think 1914. Understand how what seems to be the normal can break fundamentally and can and changed the trajectory for a century. We're still with the legacy of 1914. It was the most unaccountable and absurd major war imaginable. Historians can't even figure out really why it happened, because there was no deep reason for it to happen, except for perhaps some paranoia in the German military high command. That's not a deep reason. It's an illustration of accident. And this history teaches that these stresses might not be well managed. And that's why I cringe at the saber rattling, at the baiting China, at all of the unserious things that mark our age, because everything unserious is dangerous. And boy, have we become unserious. And we don't understand how dangerous things are and how big the accidents can be. And therefore, how much the future depends not on an inevitable rolling out of forces or the inevitable improvement of technology and going to the new singularity and the ultimate great world of high technology as some people see, or the disaster and collapse as other people see, but actually the enormous range of possibilities that are human agency, that depend on what we actually do, not on the running out of the dynamics of some differential equations that tell us that we're inevitably on a happy path or on a disastrous path. The potential for solving these problems is quite high. I don't have time to elaborate, unfortunately, and the basic message perhaps is from an economist is shown here. If you think about the kinds of solutions, for example, to climate change, the scalable non-carbon technologies, the ways to move to electric vehicles driven off of a clean power grid, as an example. If you think about what's available to us or what could be available with a bit more research and development, it's not bad. We are living on the crest still of the unparalleled scientific and technological revolution of all time. So we have a great smorgasbord of possibilities in front of us on energy, I think on agriculture, on water management. We certainly have no problem whatsoever on building clinics and schools and doing other things for the world's poorest people to break the trap of extreme poverty and at least allow the process of self-sustaining economic development to take hold. 3 times this past decade, 2 of teams that I led and then 1 team completely independent from me, estimated what it would cost, for example, to build out a full primary health system in the billion population of the world that doesn't have it right now. And the answer is about $35 billion a year, which is about 1/10 of 1% of the income of the rich world. And that is just an illustration of how utterly solvable the problems are if we decide to solve them. It's just, you'd be very surprised perhaps how hard it is to raise 1/10 of 1% of GNP, even to save 5 million lives a year. Not our problem. Who cares? And by the way, I know it's weird and it's not a scientific sample, but if you write something like this, hey, how about saving 5 million lives per year, and you put it on Huffington Post, the amount of abuse you'll get is shocking. I mean, really abusive. It's interesting. Of course, everyone's behind their pseudonyms and so forth. But basically, you'll be called an idiot, a fool, and that's just getting warmed up. That why the hell do we care about anybody else? Keep your goddamn hands out of my wallet. Keep out of my pocket. I could care less how many million people died. You'd be shocked at what you read well, I mean, everybody reads it, so I'm shocked. I don't understand it. I don't get it, how even behind a pseudonym people would write such ugliness. Some choices for America. We say that we have 3 pillars to our foreign policy. Pillar 1 is on the left. It's called defense. It should be called military, because we play both offense and defense. The second is development aid. And the third is diplomacy. That's our budget allocations. Try building a roof on those 3 pillars. Read Obama's war. It's just shocking. They couldn't find one sentence in a year of deliberations about development. But the generals, who I don't like, I really don't like. I mean, yes, I like them to protect us from invasion, but I wish they'd stop invading other countries. And I wish they'd stop determining our foreign policy. But they talk about winning the hearts and minds of the Afghan people, but they don't have the slightest iota of a clue as to what that might mean. And sad to say, our president and his team didn't try to find out. That's our problem. So those are choices we're making right now. 2 days Pentagon spending, this is a little bit out of date because it would now be bigger, is the bar on the left. The next is the annual needs for all of Africa for full comprehensive malaria control. 2 days of Pentagon spending would do it. I keep telling the Pentagon, take next Thursday and Friday off, and we can end malaria. And then the next bar is you could get all the bed nets for Africa. And then to the far right is the president's malaria budget. So you can see the point. It's choices that we're making. And that's why fundamentally this is really a matter, it is a matter of understanding. I think that's crucial. I still can't give up on the idea that rational decision-making is vital. And I'm kind of stuck with that if we can analyze this and if we can show the choices, we can actually get somewhere. But fundamentally, this is about values. And it's about finding a way in an extremely noisy world when we're absolutely frantic in this country now. Frenzied and frantic. And I think my generation was probably wrecked by television. And I worry about all generations being wrecked by endless propaganda and advertising. But I'm hoping the young are at least turning off the television, though they're now streaming everything on the computer. I don't know if it makes a difference or not. But unless we're able to pull back a little bit and understand what's at stake, we'll absolutely lose it. This Tea Party business is just shocking, of course, in how primitive it is. But what it represents in its high philosophy, this claim that taxation is slavery and that freedom to be free from responsibility to others is everything, is actually our dominant philosophy in this country now. Nobody wants to care for anybody else. The language of compassion has completely collapsed. We don't talk about the poor in this country at all. They don't exist. We talk about the middle class, the middle class, the middle class, which means median voters, supposedly. We don't even really care about the middle class because it's the rich that pay for all the campaign ads and all the campaign financing and get their way with both political parties. It's no different, unfortunately. We've seen no change, not by accident. And it's not that our policies are paralyzed, it's that both parties sup from exactly the same place. The same finance campaign, the same finance sources for the campaigns. So one is more oil and the other is more Wall Street. You choose. But it doesn't really make a difference. And underneath all of this, I have a feeling that American society is just pulling apart because we don't view ourselves as a society anymore. And probably the hardest thing in the world, although this room disproves what I'm about to say utterly, but it is managing diversity that is the hardest part for society. I have no doubt that underpinning all of this is a massive white ethnic backlash as part of this. I strongly believe that. I think the anti-immigrant feeling is extremely strong. And I think in general, the inability to handle diversity for my generation has been very hard. The good news is that for your generation of students, there seems to be a much healthier approach to life, and that's where the regeneration can come. But you're witnessing our politics, maybe in its end phase right now, and it's pretty ugly politics, and it's got to change. I hope that Obama would be the change, but he's not being the change because he's still part of the old politics. Maybe he'll be a transition, but so far, not. It hasn't happened. And we're still in the same wars, we're still in the same tax cuts, we're still in the same endless fights about the environment and about climate. And we haven't figured out how to live together yet with the mutual responsibility. And another reason I worry about it is that my favorite places in the world, in terms of governance and responsibility, which are the Scandinavian countries, are showing the same difficulty right now of managing diversity and immigration. Sweden, which I always hold as the paragon of social ethics and virtue, just elected a far-right party to the parliament, and that is definitely an anti-immigration backlash. I mean, that's explicitly what that party is about. And so it's quite fragile. And it really comes back to the question of, can we make a world society? And a world society is not only markets that work, and it's not only technological systems, it's actually a shared global ethic. And unless we can get to a shared global ethic, we probably can't make the world work right to solve these problems, because we need a tremendous amount of cooperation. And if you feel that the other side is not a partner and it's not part of your society, it probably can't work. So I really do feel that this comes down to the ethics, and it comes down to the shared values. And there have been times when leadership has made a huge difference. And my favorite guy from my youth in leadership was John Kennedy. And one fantastic thing that he did, and I would really commend you, especially the students, to go online and listen to the speech he gave on June 10, 1963, which is called his peace speech. And it was a speech that he gave trying to convince the American people that it would be possible to make peace with the Soviet Union at the time, just after the world nearly destroyed itself in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he said that if we're going to make peace with the Soviets, it doesn't depend on them, it depends on our own attitude. And he gave a wonderful speech, which I want you to listen to. And the end of that, the consequence of that speech was that Khrushchev, his counterpart at the Soviet Union, said, "I want to make peace with that man." That was the finest speech that an American president has given since Franklin Roosevelt, was exactly the words that Khrushchev said to the U.S. envoy in Moscow. And 5 weeks later came the partial nuclear test ban treaty. It is, in my view, an illustration how an act of human will and vision can change the world, can make it possible to foresee a new world of cooperation. And in that speech are my favorite lines about this whole issue, which I think settled for me what is the upside possibility for the planet. Kennedy said, "So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air, we all cherish our children's futures, and we are all